I never planned to open the old wooden box that sat at the back of my father's bookshelf. It was sealed with a thin strip of wax and dusted over with years of silence. I found it one evening while cleaning his study after he passed away. The light from the window fell softly on the lid, revealing faint initials carved in a careful hand. SRI ran my fingers over it. And for reasons I couldn't explain, my heart tightened. My father, Mr. Samuel Reed, was a quiet man, gentle and deeply private. Even in his last years, when illness took away most of his strength, he held on to his books, his letters, and a strange peace that never made sense to me. When I finally opened the box, I expected to find his notes, maybe old poems or drafts from his teaching days. But what I found were love letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper had yellowed, the ink smudged by time, but the handwriting was clear and graceful. My father's words spoke of love, regret, and something that sounded like a promise broken long ago. I could almost hear his voice in the rhythm of the sentences. He had written to a woman named Elara, a name I had never heard before. I kept reading, letter after letter, feeling like a stranger inside my father's life. But then I reached the last envelope, and my heart nearly stopped. The handwriting was his, but the name written on it wasn't Elara, it was Clara, my fiancée. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the name. My hands trembled, and I could feel the blood rushing to my ears. I read the envelope again and again, hoping I was mistaken, that perhaps Clara was a common name, that it couldn't be the same woman I was about to marry. But deep inside, something cold and sharp began to stir. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against the window, and the house felt heavier than ever. I kept thinking about my father's eyes, the way they sometimes softened whenever Clara's name came up. I had always thought it was simple affection for my future wife, but now I wasn't sure anymore. And so began the longest week of my life. The morning after I found the letters, I sat in the kitchen, staring at a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The house was quiet. My father's chair remained in its usual place near the window, his reading glasses still folded neatly on the table beside it. It felt wrong somehow to disturb anything. He had always lived by routine, gentle and predictable, like the tick of the clock that now seemed louder than ever. I kept the letters in a drawer for days, pretending nothing had changed. But something inside me had. Every time my phone buzzed with a message from Clara, I felt a strange weight in my chest. She would send me little notes, reminders about our upcoming wedding, pictures of the venue her father had chosen, the grand ballroom of the Hale estate. Everything about her world was shining and beautiful. Mine had always been simple, ordinary, and full of quiet corners. We were different, but I had believed our differences made us whole. Clara came from a life of luxury, raised in houses that looked like art museums. Her father, Mr. Donovan Hale, was known for his power, his influence, and his cold perfection. When I first met him, he shook my hand with a smile that never reached his eyes. He once said, "Love is a beautiful thing, Aaron, but stability is what lasts." I didn't respond. I just smiled, because I was taught that silence was safer than pride. Clara was different from him, or at least I thought so. She had a warmth, a softness in her laughter that made me forget the distance between our worlds. She told me she admired how I lived simply, how I cared for my aging father, when her own world revolved around business dinners and private jets. Sometimes, late at night, we'd talk about dreams, small ones, like reading by the fire, or walking hand in hand through quiet streets after rain. Those moments made me believe that love could bridge anything. But after my father's death, something in her changed. She became distant, thoughtful, and often distracted. She said it was stress, that the wedding was too much, that her father was pushing her into choices she didn't want to make. I tried to understand. I wanted to be patient. But there were times I caught her looking at my father's photo with a strange kind of sorrow, as if she was remembering something she couldn't say out loud. One evening, she visited the house. The rain had just stopped, and the garden smelled of wet earth and roses. She brought flowers from my father's grave and stood quietly in front of his photo for a long time. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were glistening. "Your father was a remarkable man," she said softly. "I wish I'd known him better." I smiled faintly. "He liked you," I said. "He said you had an old soul." She nodded, but didn't speak. Then she walked toward the study, running her fingers along the bookshelf. Her gaze stopped for a moment on the space where the wooden box had been, the same box I had hidden days ago. I watched her closely, and something in her expression told me she knew it was gone. "Clara," I said, my voice almost breaking, "did you ever meet my father before we did?" She froze. It was just for a second, but I saw it, the brief flicker of guilt. Then she smiled and said, "Of course not." "Why would I?" Her voice was calm, almost too calm. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to erase the unease growing between us, but when she left that night, the silence she left behind felt heavier than before. Later, as I sat alone in the study, I took out the letters again. My father's words to Alara were full of longing, a love that could not survive the world's cruelty. But the letter addressed to Clara was different. It wasn't romantic, but it was personal, deeply so. The words were gentle but protective, as though he had written to someone he loved once through another time, another face. I couldn't make sense of it, but I knew I couldn't ask him anymore. The days passed slowly. The wedding was 2 weeks away. Her father called often, making sure I knew how grateful he was that Clara had chosen someone grounded. His tone was polite, but sharp, like a man checking his investments. I told myself to stay calm, to keep the peace, because that's what my father would have wanted. But peace was a fragile thing, and sometimes the truth has a way of finding you no matter how much you try to bury it. The wedding invitations had already gone out. Our names Zarin Reed and Clara Hale were printed in gold on ivory paper. Everyone around us seemed to float in excitement. Friends, relatives, business associates, photographers. Yet I felt as though I was standing in the middle of a silent room while the noise swirled around me. Something inside me refused to celebrate. Every time I saw Clara smile for the camera, I wondered if that smile belonged to me or to the ghost of a past she wouldn't admit. I kept reading my father's letters in secret. They became an ache I carried with me everywhere. Each letter felt alive, like a heartbeat trapped in paper. He wrote about love that defied circumstance, about choices made out of duty, about parting with someone not because the love had ended, but because the world demanded it. There was tenderness and grief in every line. And hidden among the pages, there were fragments that unsettled me, mentions of a family that would never forgive, and of a daughter who must never know. The night before the wedding rehearsal, I couldn't bear it any longer. I went to see Clara at her family's mansion, hoping perhaps foolishly that I could find the truth in her eyes. The Hale estate loomed before me like something carved from moonlight and marble. Guards nodded as I passed through the gates. Inside, everything smelled of polished wood and roses. Clara met me in the hallway, wearing a pale dress and no shoes. She looked surprised to see me, but not displeased. "Aaron," she said gently, "you look tired." "I found something," I said quietly. From my father. Her face stilled, the way a pond stills when the wind stops. "What kind of something?" "Letters," I said. From years ago, I watched her carefully. Her breath hitched, barely perceptible, but enough. She turned away, pretending to adjust a vase on the table. "Your father was a writer. It's natural, he'd have old letters. One of them," I continued, "was addressed to you." She froze. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then she turned back to me, her eyes wide, trembling between fear and disbelief. "Aaron," she whispered, "you must be mistaken." I wanted to believe her, but the silence between her words told me everything. "Tell me the truth," I said. "How did you know him?" She sat down slowly on the velvet couch, her hands clasped together. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said. "I met him years ago. When I was a teenager, I attended a charity reading where he spoke about poetry. I admired him deeply. He wrote to me after that." Her voice trembled. "He was kind, thoughtful. He spoke to me like an equal when everyone else treated me like a child of wealth. But it wasn't what you think, Aaron. He saw something in me that reminded him of someone he once loved. That's all." I wanted to believe her words, but the letter I'd read was still burned into my mind. It wasn't simply admiration. It was intimate, personal. It was a man writing to someone he cared for deeply. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because," she said softly, "I knew how it would sound. You'd think there was something wrong, something shameful. I didn't want that shadow over us." I looked at her, trying to see honesty beneath the tears in her eyes. "And your father? Did he know?" She hesitated. That hesitation was my answer. Her father entered then, his presence commanding, as always. "Aaron," he said, his tone smooth, "it's late. We have a long day tomorrow." I turned to him. "Did you know my father wrote to Clara?" He smiled faintly, almost pitying. "Your father was a passionate man. He believed in words more than in the world. But let the past stay buried, son. You've got a future to think about." He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. It felt like both a warning and a dismissal. That night, I walked out of the Halle estate with a storm raging inside me. I didn't know whether I was angry, betrayed, or simply broken. My father, my fiancée, her father, all connected by a web I couldn't yet see. Days passed in silence. Clara tried to reach me, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I buried myself in work, in meaningless tasks, anything to avoid thinking. Yet everywhere I turned, my father's words haunted me. The letter to Clara ended with a single line that replayed in my head: "If she loves you truly, protect her from what I could not." I didn't know what it meant until I received a small envelope in the mail a few days later. It had no return address, only my name written in a shaky hand. Inside was a note from an old friend of my father's, one of his colleagues from the university. The letter said my father had once loved a woman named Elara Hale, long before I was born. She had been from a wealthy family who forbade their relationship. She married another man instead, Donovan Hale. I sat there staring at the paper until the words blurred. My father's lost love. It was Clara's mother. Everything made sense then. The hidden sorrow in my father's eyes whenever he looked at Clara. The familiarity in her features. The way he treated her with unspoken tenderness. And the letter addressed to her, it wasn't love in the present. It was a message written to the daughter of the woman he once loved. I felt the world shift under me. The woman I was going to marry was the daughter of the woman my father had once loved. And her father, the man who had destroyed that love, was now offering me his daughter's hand, as if to rewrite history in his own way. The realization left me breathless. I didn't know what to do or who to confront first, but I knew I couldn't walk into that wedding pretending anymore. The next evening, I went to the cemetery. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and lilies. I knelt beside my father's grave, the letters in my hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "Why did you leave me to find this alone?" The wind stirred the trees, as if the world itself sighed. I realized then that this wasn't just about secrets or betrayal. It was about generations of love tangled in silence, about people who hurt each other in the name of pride. I felt anger, but also pity. And somewhere within that storm of emotion, a quiet strength began to form. I would face them, but not with rage, with truth. The morning of the wedding rehearsal arrived with an eerie quiet. The sky hung low and gray, and a fine mist clung to the windows. I had barely slept. My father's letters were spread out on the table, their fragile pages marked by time and sorrow. I read them again, slowly, as though searching for a message he had left just for me. Every word carried the weight of choices made in another lifetime. The love he had lost, the silence he had endured, the burden he had carried to his grave. When I looked at Clara's handwriting on the RSVP cards, her soft curves of ink beside my own, I felt a strange ache. I still loved her. Even after everything, even after the lies and the hidden history, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. Love has a cruel way of surviving what logic cannot. But I knew I couldn't walk into that church pretending everything was pure. The truth had already changed us, even if no one else knew. So that morning I made a decision to seek the truth, not for vengeance, but for understanding. I wanted to hear it from the only person who could confirm what my father's letters had, whispered Mr. Donovan Hale when I arrived at his office. The world of wealth surrounded me, marble floors, glass walls, portraits of himself, shaking hands with politicians and kings. His secretary looked startled to see me without an appointment, but I didn't stop. I pushed the heavy door open and found him standing by the window overlooking the city, like a man surveying his empire. He turned, his usual composed expression settling on his face. "Aaron," he said calmly, "this is quite a surprise." "I need to know the truth," I said quietly. "About my father, about your wife, about why you allowed this marriage." He studied me for a long moment. Then he sighed, walking slowly to his desk. "Sit down," he said. He looked older that day, more human somehow. His confidence seemed to waver for the first time. "Your father," he began, "was a good man, better than most. I knew that long before you were born." "So you knew him," I said. "Yes," he admitted, "more than you realize. My wife Elara loved him. Before me, before this life. His eyes drifted toward the window again. Her family forced her to marry me. They wanted power and stability. She never truly forgave them. And he paused. He never forgave himself. I felt the air thicken between us. And Clara, I asked. Did she know? He hesitated. Ilara told her before she died. She made me promise never to let Clara repeat her mistake, to never marry for love that came from struggle or poverty. She believed such love only leads to pain. That's why I opposed you at first. My throat tightened. So this marriage was what? A test. A way to end the cycle. He looked at me sharply. In a way, yes. I wanted to see what you were made of. Whether you were like your father, chasing dreams that crumble under the weight of reality, or whether you had the strength to let go. I stared at him, realizing that our engagement, our love, our entire story had been shaped by a past neither of us had chosen. Two families bound by history's unfinished chapter, and I was standing in the echo of their regrets. You manipulated us, I said softly. I protected my daughter, he corrected. And perhaps, in a strange way, I protected you too. You wouldn't have survived her world. There was no anger in his tone, only conviction. The kind of conviction that comes from living too long with one's own sins. I turned toward the door, my voice low. You protected no one. You just repeated your own cruelty. He didn't stop me as I walked away. The silence behind me was heavy, but it didn't follow me out. I left it there in his office full of glass and ghosts. That evening, I met Clara at the church. The candles were lit, their flames soft and unsteady. She stood near the altar, her dress simple, her expression pale. When she saw me, she looked both relieved and terrified. Aaron, she whispered, you went to see my father, didn't you? I did. Her eyes filled with tears. Then you know everything. I nodded. I know enough. She stepped closer, trembling. I never meant to hurt you. I thought I could keep the past buried. I thought if we just kept loving each other, it wouldn't matter. Maybe love should be enough, I said quietly. But it isn't, not when it's built on silence. She looked down, her tears falling on the marble floor. My mother told me once, she said softly, that love and pain often come from the same place. I didn't understand her then. I do now. I reached into my coat and pulled out the final letter, the one addressed to her in my father's handwriting. He wrote this for you, I said. But I think he meant it for both of us. She took it with shaking hands and opened it slowly. The paper crackled as she unfolded it. Her eyes moved across the page, and with every line, her shoulders sank lower. When she finished, she pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing quietly. What did it say? I asked. She looked at me, her voice breaking. He said, love is not a prize to be earned, or a war to be won. It's a promise to be kept even when the world forgets. We stood there in silence, surrounded by flickering light and the faint scent of wax and flowers. I didn't know what our future would be. Maybe the wedding would still happen. Maybe it wouldn't. But in that moment, I felt something shift between us. Not anger, not even forgiveness, but understanding. The kind that comes after truth is finally spoken aloud. Later that night, as I walked home, the city lights blurred through the mist. I thought of my father, the man who loved deeply but quietly, who carried his pain without complaint, who left me the truth not to destroy, but to free. And for the first time since finding the letters, I felt at peace. But peace doesn't last forever. Sometimes it arrives only to prepare you for the next truth waiting in the shadows. The morning after the church, I woke to a strange calm. The storm that had haunted my thoughts for weeks had finally passed. The sky outside was pale blue, brushed with sunlight. Birds were singing near the window, and for the first time in a long while, the air didn't feel heavy. Still, peace is never simple. It comes with the quiet realization that something is ending. I brewed tea the way my father used to, letting the steam curl upward before pouring it. His absence still lingered in every sound, every creak of the old floorboards. But now, his silence didn't hurt the same way. It felt almost protective, like he had left a part of himself to guide me through what came next. Clara called that afternoon. Her voice was faint, as though she had been crying for hours. Aaron, she said softly, can we meet? We chose the park near the river, the same one where we used to walk when we first fell in love. The leaves were beginning to turn gold, the water reflecting the light like glass. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench beneath a willow tree. She looked small and fragile in her cream coat, her eyes red from tears. When she saw me, she stood up quickly. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. I nodded, sitting beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world around us was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant laughter of children. "I told my father I can't go through with the wedding," she said at last. "He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He said I was making the same mistake my mother did, choosing love that would only bring pain." "And what do you think?" I asked gently. She smiled faintly. "I think my mother never regretted loving your father. She only regretted letting others decide for her. I won't do that." Her words were brave, but her eyes held sorrow. I reached for her hand. "Clara, what we had was real," I said softly. "But I don't want us to carry our parents' ghosts anymore. Maybe love isn't meant to fix the past. Maybe it's meant to teach us how to let go." She looked at me, tears shimmering. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said. "You'll just remember me differently. Not as someone who walked away, but as someone who finally understood." We sat there for a long time, hands still intertwined, watching the sun sink lower. When she finally stood to leave, she turned and smiled, a soft, broken smile that carried gratitude more than pain. "Your father was right," she said. "Love isn't about winning. It's about keeping a promise." After she left, I stayed on the bench watching the ripples in the river. The reflection of the willows swayed gently on the water, as if bowing in farewell. I thought about my father again, about the love he had buried, the pain he never voiced, and the letters he had left behind as a map through his silence. I realized he hadn't written them to haunt me. He'd written them to heal what he couldn't in his own life. That evening, I returned home and placed all the letters back into the wooden box. This time, I didn't seal it with wax. I tied the blue ribbon carefully and set the box by the window where the sunlight could touch it. I whispered, "It's finished, Father." In that moment, I felt him there, not as memory, but as peace. A few weeks later, Clara left for Paris. She sent a letter before she went. Her words were gentle. "I will always be grateful to you for showing me love that asked for nothing. I think that's the kind your father wrote about. Maybe, in another lifetime, we would have been born at the right time when love didn't have to fight so hard to be simple." I smiled when I read it. I didn't cry this time. Love, I realized, doesn't disappear when it ends. It simply changes shape, from holding someone's hand to wishing them well from afar. Months passed, the seasons shifted quietly. I spent my days teaching literature, walking through the same streets my father once walked. Sometimes, I'd see couples holding hands in the rain and think of Clara's laugh, of the way she'd tilt her head when she was lost in thought. There was no bitterness anymore, only a soft ache, the kind that reminds you you've lived deeply. One afternoon, while sorting through my father's old papers, I found a small note tucked inside one of his books. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a line written in his elegant hand. When love is silenced, it doesn't die. It waits to be understood. I folded the paper and slipped it into my wallet. I carried it with me from that day on. It became my quiet reminder that some truths aren't meant to break us. They're meant to reveal who we really are when everything else falls away. As winter came, I visited his grave again. Snow covered the ground, and the air was still. I placed a single rose on the stone and stood there for a long time. "You were right," I whispered. "Love isn't about possession or perfection. It's about grace, the kind that lets go without hate." The wind brushed against my face, and I felt a strange warmth in that cold. It was as if he was saying goodbye at last. And as I walked away, I realized something quietly beautiful. Every story, no matter how painful, holds a gift if we're willing to see it. My father's letters had given me that, not a perfect ending, but a clearer heart. Years later, I still keep my father's box by the window. The ribbon has faded even more now, soft and pale like the wings of an old butterfly. I rarely open it anymore, not because I've forgotten, but because I no longer need to. The letters have already done their work. They carried pain, yes, but they also carried peace. Sometimes, on rainy afternoons, I make tea and sit in the same chair where my father once read. The sound of rain against the glass reminds me of the night I first opened that box, when everything I thought I knew about love and family began to unravel. But now, when I remember it, I don't feel anger. I just feel gratitude. It's strange, isn't it? How love can wound and heal us with the same hand. My father's love for Ilara taught me that not every story ends the way we wish. Some loves are meant to remain in letters, not in lives. And yet, even unfinished, they shape the people we become. Clara and I never saw each other again after that day in the park. Once I saw her name in a magazine. She had become an art curator in Paris, working with young artists, helping them find their voices. There was a picture of her standing by a painting, sunlight on her face, her smile peaceful, not forced. I stared at that image for a long time and realized something beautiful. She had found the kind of freedom her mother never had, and perhaps, in some small way, my father's story had helped her reach it. As for me, life became quieter, simpler. I moved to a cottage by the coast, where I teach poetry to small groups of students who still believe in the softness of words. Some evenings I tell them stories not of fame or wealth, but of hearts that learned to stay kind even after breaking. They listen in silence, the same way I once listened to my father. And sometimes, when the light falls just right through the window, I swear I can almost see him there, smiling faintly, proud. One of my students once asked me, "Sir, do you believe in happy endings?" I thought about it for a while before answering. "I believe," I said, "that happiness isn't always in endings. Sometimes it's in understanding why things had to happen the way they did." He nodded, perhaps not fully understanding, but one day he will. We all do, eventually. That night, I stood outside and looked at the sea. The waves were calm, glowing silver under the moonlight. I remembered my father's last line, "If she loves you truly, protect her from what I could not." For years I thought it was a warning. Now I know it was a blessing. He wasn't asking me to protect her from harm. He was asking me to protect her from the kind of pain that comes from silence and pride. And maybe, by letting her go, I did. I closed my eyes, breathed in the salt air, and whispered into the wind, "Thank you, Father, for everything." The breeze carried my words across the water, and I felt light, like the weight of generations had finally lifted. Because in the end, what I learned was simple and eternal. Love doesn't always arrive in the form of forever. Sometimes it comes as a lesson, a letter, or a memory that teaches us how to be human. And as I turned back toward the warm glow of my cottage, I smiled quietly, completely, knowing that wealth can build empires, but only love, in its purest, gentlest form, can build peace.